Lines with Ireti Bakare-Yusuf. Fridays at 4 p.m. Let's talk.
And good afternoon, Lagos. How are you, Nigeria? Wherever you are tuning in from. I know some of you are listening abroad, especially in Europe. Welcome to Borderlines. Yes, the final Borderlines of the year, but certainly not the final Borderline edition. My name is Ireti Bakare-Yusuf, as you know. So let me introduce, I have a distinguished guest with me, and he's already online, as it's just typical with distinguished people. But let me just tell you his profile. I did tell you all that were listening during Down for Conversations to go and Google him, so you will be ready. But in case you didn't get a chance to check out his name, Kenneth Roth is the Charles and Marie Robertson Visiting Professor at the Princeton School for Public and International Affairs. Until August 2020, he served for nearly 3 decades as the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Yes, now you know why he's so distinguished. One of the world's leading international human rights organization, which operates in some 100 countries. Before that, Kenneth Roth was a federal prosecutor in New York and for the Iran-Contra investigation in Washington. I could go on and on and on, but let me just tell you, part of why he's also here is, yes, he's one of those people that also helped us, when I say us, the world, to set up the ICC. Professor Kenneth Roth, it's my absolute pleasure to have you on Borderlines.
I'm very honored to be here. I look forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. Am I correct? Because something tells me that I might be. Am I correct that this is the first time you're on Nigerian radio?
No, that's actually not true.
I don't like that. I thought we had an exclusive. Anyway, go ahead.
I'm sorry. No. I visited Nigeria a few times. I've done many radio and TV and print. So, but it's nice to be back, and it's nice to be back with you in particular.
Absolutely. Thank you. So let's get straight to it. The first thing I often ask most of my guests is October 7th. Where were you when you heard of the attack, Hamas's attack on Israel? Where were you? What were your first thoughts?
Well, I was in New York, and I became increasingly horrified as I understood the scale of the slaughter taking place. And I think it's important to note, I mean, some people try to justify what Hamas did by saying, oh, they're resisting Israeli occupation. And if all that they did was to shoot at Israeli soldiers, that would be an adequate justification. But that's not what they did. They went in and they deliberately slaughtered Israeli civilians. They raped Israeli women. They fired rockets indiscriminately into civilian populated areas. And all of that, those are all war crimes. And so it's important to realize that, just because there may be, some justice in the cause of resisting Israeli occupation, that in no sense justifies the commission of war crimes. And Hamas did that on a massive scale on October 7th.
Indeed. Immediately after that attack, Israel released 1,400 people had been killed. We know that a large number were killed at the festival, at the Nova Music Festival. Come November 15th, Israel has reduced that number to 1,200. In fact, since then, it's reduced even more to 1,170 or so, something about that. On the 8th, Israel declared, Netanyahu stood up and he declared war against Hamas. Therefore, they began the bombarding campaign in Gaza. Over 400 people died immediately. What are your thoughts on that when you hear our war is against Hamas? Day one of that war, over 400 Gazans. Now, today, we are at 21,000 and rising. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I mean, just as in the case of Hamas, I think it's important to distinguish between the justice of Israeli responding to Hamas and the way that it's responding. So Israel had every right to defend itself. Hamas had launched this brutal attack. Israel had a right to respond. And so if Israel had just attacked, Hamas soldiers, I think few people would be quarreling with it today. But instead, Israel has attacked with very little concern for Palestinian civilians. It has fired indiscriminately into entire areas, just reducing them to rubble. Even sometimes when it has attacked a military target, it has used these huge bombs that predictably have a massive cost in terms of Palestinian civilian lives. It also has imposed this siege on 2.2 million people, largely depriving them of basic food, water, electricity, fuel, medicine, the necessities of life. And so, again, it's important to note that even though Hamas committed war crimes on October 7th, that does not justify war crimes in response. The responsibilities of international humanitarian law exist independently on both sides, and they are not based on reciprocity. So the fact that one side commits a war crime does not justify the other side in committing war crimes. And Israel, has been committing big time war crimes with the enormous civilian toll that you note. At this point, 21,000 people killed, and the number keeps rising.
Indeed. Let's talk about war crimes. Very quickly, within a month, 2 weeks to a month, the word genocide, we started to hear, experts, journalists, spokespeople suggesting that, look, some were saying Israel is either heading towards a genocide, Israel is committing a genocide, or some are actually saying Israel has broken international law. Firstly, what in your eyes, you said Israel has a right to defend itself. What would you call that defense with regards to proportional representation or proportional defense? What is proportion? What would have been proportional?
Well, the requirement of proportionality applies actually to every single attack. So before somebody pulls the trigger, even if they're firing at a military target, they have to ask, is the anticipated harm to civilians excessive in relationship to the direct, concrete military advantage? And there have been many times when that simply has not been the case. For example, Israel went after a Hamas command center in the Jabalia refugee camp. It didn't do this by sending in soldiers and trying to close off the tunnels. It didn't, use small bombs that were going to aim just at the soldiers. It went in with at least two 2,000-pound bombs. These are enormous bombs that leave massive craters that destroy buildings left and right, which is why we have a death toll from that attack on a heavily populated refugee camp of somewhere between 160 and 400 people, just to go after a command center. And that, illustrates the kind of disproportionate attack that the Israeli government has been pursuing. Other times, they've been going after these, big apartment towers, I think basically because they see those as sort of the prestige addresses in Gaza. And they say, maybe there was some Hamas presence there. They then destroy the entire apartment building, rendering 100 families homeless in one shot. And you see these things over and over. There's been much talk about the hospitals, and Israel keeps saying, there are command centers underneath the hospitals. Now, in fact, they haven't proved that. So far they've shown a few rifles and a tunnel, but that's about it. But in the process, they have shut down, perhaps 2/3 of Gaza's hospitals. And this is, in the middle of a war. So you have acute need for hospitals. People are being severely injured, and these hospitals are closed, or even if they're functioning without anesthesia, without electricity, without, basics for medical care. And this, you can imagine the repercussions just for ordinary people, pregnant women who cannot give birth in a hospital, people who are on cancer treatment where that treatment stops, people on dialysis where suddenly their treatment stops. So this is, these are huge consequences for the civilian population with, little, if any, military advantage. What was really in that hospital that required them to be shut down? And so these are, illustrations of what has broadly been condemned as disproportionate attacks by the Israeli government.
Let's talk about Netanyahu's 16-year relationship with Hamas. And for some reason, it appears that everybody wants to shift from that. it's not being discussed in Israel anymore. Haaretz, who is probably the most liberal newspaper in Israel, did talk about it, but most of them are shifting away from it. When I had the Israeli ambassador on the show, he didn't want to talk about it either. In fact, Hamas didn't like to talk about it. Can I talk about it with you? Netanyahu, who said something to the tune of, you know, if you want to redeem Gaza or something like that, you need to continue to work with Hamas.
I'm happy to talk about it. And I think the way to understand Netanyahu's relationship with Hamas until October 7th is that Netanyahu's top priority was undermining any possibility of a two-state solution. And there were different elements of it. I mean, I recently traveled to the West Bank, and if you walk to a hilltop and you look around, you realize that the West Bank is completely chopped up by settlements and outposts and bypass roads. I saw a number recently that there are actually 160, basically Bantustans in the West Bank. So, nothing like a contiguous, viable Palestinian state, but rather these tiny little enclaves of partial self-rule. And this was by design. This was to make it territorially impossible for a two-state solution. But coming to your question with Hamas, Netanyahu also wanted to make it politically impossible to have a two-state solution. The Palestinian Authority, which is the dominant force in the West Bank, is utterly corrupt. It has been discredited because it hasn't been able to stop the settlements. It has refused to have an election in 16 years. It is elderly at this stage. And so it has no real political viability. And then in Gaza, Netanyahu was perfectly happy to have Hamas there because nobody was pressing him to negotiate with Hamas. Hamas was seen as a terrorist group. And so he actually greenlighted Qatar sending billions of dollars in aid, to Hamas to support it, in essence. And this served Netanyahu because he didn't think Hamas would ever be a serious military threat. But he saw the political advantage of having a force like Hamas discrediting the Palestinian side, so he would not face any pressure to proceed with a two-state solution. And that's what we have today. We have, essentially a one-state reality, which is what they call it in Israel. And that is a one-state reality of perpetual occupation and basically apartheid, because Netanyahu has no plans to give equal rights to the Palestinians in the occupied territory. He just wants to repress them and occupy them forever.
In Nigeria, we have a saying, and since you've been to Nigeria many times, or before, you may have heard it. We have a saying, I'll say it in Yoruba, and then I'll translate it in English. They say, "Ọmọ tó ní ìyá òun ò ní sùn, òun náà ò ní fojú kanran." It would appear Hamas is the child that said the mother will not sleep, right? Therefore, Netanyahu also will never get a lie in.
Yeah. No, I mean, this was a very cynical calculation on Netanyahu's part. And obviously, he misjudged Hamas's military capacity. I mean, if you look even, the morning of October 7th, there were warnings by Israeli intelligence that something was underway. In fact, they had been watching over the course of the prior year as Hamas practiced for October 7th, and practiced raiding a fake kibbutz or practiced, the paragliding assaults on the border. So there was plenty of evidence that something like this was in the works, but Netanyahu just didn't believe it. And he thought, they wouldn't dare do this. They don't have the capacity. They're mainly interested in jobs and in improving the economy. And so, Netanyahu was kind of suckered by Hamas. Hamas did a good job of deceiving him. But it shows, the danger in Netanyahu's cynical support for Hamas until October 7th, because his top priority, as I mentioned, was avoiding any pressure for a two-state solution. He wanted to retain the occupied territory forever.
Let's talk about Netanyahu himself and his political career. He's been there, 2016 or so, that he's been there for quite a while now. Prior to October 7th, he was facing a lot of pushback from the citizens of Israel regards his judicial reform. And basically, some accused him of wanting to become, a dictator, if you like, and with
at least an autocrat. Yes,
yes, an autocrat. Thank you. What do you think? Since October 7th, I went to Israel. I was invited to Israel, and what I noticed from the people I spoke to, both moderates and extremists, if you like, or Zionists, is that October 7th appeared to have pulled them close together. These were people who had, differing politics and ideology, but now they've come together. Yet they are accepting that Netanyahu continues to fight this war. So what would you say is the chance of Netanyahu surviving as the prime minister of Israel?
I think the chances are very small. In other words, let's go back to before October 7th. I mean, as you note, Israel was experiencing really the largest anti-government demonstrations in its history. And the cause of that was Netanyahu trying to avoid criminal corruption charges that he faced, was seeking to undermine the independence of the judiciary. And, Israel is, it's a democracy within the Green Line, within Israel proper, not the occupied territory. But it's a democracy with very few checks and balances. And so you have, just one branch of the legislature, the Knesset. The majority in the Knesset is the government. And there's no separate president. There are no, kind of regional legislatures or regional governors. There's really nothing within the government itself to rein in the Knesset majority other than the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court has played a very important role and has, tried to limit certain oversteps by the government. Not everything. The Supreme Court is far from perfect, but it has been a check on governmental overreach. And Netanyahu wanted to stop that. And the people of Israel saw the danger of that. They saw that, if this last official check on executive power was destroyed, you would be moving toward autocracy. And so these mass demonstrations took place. Then October 7th happened. So, October 7th, in a sense, was the salvation for Netanyahu from these demonstrations. But they, at the same time, were a real slap in the face at his competence, because many people say that while the country was so focused on, his efforts to expand the settlements and to attack the Supreme Court, they took their eye off the ball with respect to what Hamas was doing. And so while Israelis don't want to change prime minister in the middle of a war, he's put together a war cabinet, which includes his opponents. So there's a willingness to allow that cabinet to proceed. But as soon as the war is over, there will immediately be a commission of inquiry into what happened on October 7th, what was the intelligence failure, and Netanyahu is very likely to be ousted. And so, sadly, this creates an incentive for Netanyahu to continue fighting the war, because he still hopes that, somehow there will be this kind of magical solution to the war and he will emerge as this great hero and he might be able to save his position as prime minister and avoid prison. But, not many people think that that's likely. And I think that it's really a question of just, how many Palestinian civilians have to die for Netanyahu's political ambitions at this stage.
Some have even actually suggested that he may have known or looked away deliberately to keep himself in power and therefore to justify this extension. Of course, we know the election is next year in Israel, and this partnership that he's got with the extreme right wing of Israel in Israel's politics is already quite shaky. Who do you think is likely to take over from him?
Well, first, I should say, I think it's probably too cynical to say that Netanyahu, knew that the October 7th attack was going to happen and ignored it. I don't think even he's that cynical. I think the safer thing to say is that he just, ignored the intelligence that it might happen because he was preoccupied with his settlement expansion and attacking the Supreme Court. So, let's not overstate that there. But, that said, it's unclear what happens next. I mean, as you note, his current governing coalition includes some extraordinarily unsavory extreme right figures. People who really just, if they could, would expel all the Palestinians, and that would be their solution. So these are really awful people. Now, I think what's likely to happen is that some kind of centrist coalition would emerge. And it would be, perhaps even elements of Netanyahu's party, but without Netanyahu, but other kind of more centrist and maybe even slightly left members of the Knesset. It's hard to know, what that coalition would be at this point because it doesn't currently exist. But there are, people like Benny Gantz, who's currently in the war cabinet, who's a respected former general, former prime minister, people like that who could emerge as a new leader. And I think what we all hope is that whoever emerges has the political courage to try to resume negotiations with Palestinians. This idea that the two-state solution is dead is, kind of a de facto accurate description. But it could be reversed. In other words, if somebody came in and said, okay, I'm willing to dismantle or transfer a large number of the settlements. I'm willing to reach out to the Palestinians rather than always crush them. Things could begin to look differently. It's not clear that that's going to happen at all. But that's, the more hopeful scenario.
Indeed, Benny Gantz and Ben-Gvir and others have actually echoed words of intentional genocide by Israel.
Let's distinguish the two. Ben-Gvir, yeah, not Benny Gantz. And Benny Gantz, I think, most people see him as a decent guy. But Ben-Gvir is awful. He's one of the extreme ministers in Netanyahu's cabinet. But, we don't have to look that far for the awful language. Look at Netanyahu himself. I mean, he invoked this biblical section, the story of Amalek,
yes,
where there's a divine injunction to kill every man, woman, child, and animal. Now, why would Netanyahu talk about that in the middle of the war? He basically is sending the signal, I don't care about Palestinian civilian deaths. Just, crush Hamas and kill as many as need be. Or even, the defense minister, Gallant, who in talking about the siege, sort of talking about all of Gaza, said these are human animals. Completely dehumanizing people, and again saying, I don't care about civilian casualties. So this is basically incitement to war crimes. These are direct evidence of command responsibility for war crimes. And we see that, these are not the extremists in Netanyahu's government. This is Netanyahu himself and his defense minister.
So Benny Gantz, I think he's on record as saying Israel's war against Hamas is existential and carries no time limit. Yet you call him a moderate, or is it just a case of the worst and the worst, or the devil and the deep blue sea?
Yeah. No, look, the entire political spectrum in Israel has moved significantly to the right. When Israelis say this is an existential attack or threat, I think that reflects how much they were shaken by the October 7th attack, because they really had come to expect that the Israeli army would protect them. And in fact, the Israeli army was largely asleep. And so, here we have, hundreds, possibly over 1,000 civilians killed just in the course of a day, and that really did shake Israelis. So to say, in that sense, it's existential, fair enough. But again, that doesn't justify responding with war crimes. Even an existential threat needs to be responded to within the laws of war, within humanitarian law. And I say this, not as a human rights activist, because, it's not human rights activists who wrote the Geneva Conventions and their protocols. It was the militaries of the world. These were rules that militaries adopted for themselves. And they're basic rules. You cannot shoot at civilians. You cannot fire indiscriminately into civilian areas. You cannot, fire at a military target if the harm to civilians will be disproportionate. You cannot starve or besiege civilians. These are pretty basic rules, nothing complicated here. These are the rules that, Israel and every other military says that they abide by. They just aren't doing it. Because of these kind of signals from the top, they are, ignoring Palestinian civilian deaths. They're discounting Palestinian civilian life. And the result is what we see is, large parts of Gaza have been just decimated, flattened. And we have, 21,000 and counting deaths in Gaza, with also, large scale hunger and imminent starvation. Many of the hospitals dysfunctional. I mean, it's it is the world's by far worst humanitarian crisis at the moment.
We say often, the elephant in the room is the one that nobody wants to mention. But in this case, let's call them the hawk over all of this, which is the US, right?
Yes.
In 2021, you wrote an essay, and I'll just read the first paragraph of it. You wrote, after 4 years of a president who was indifferent and often hostile to human rights, the November 2020 election of Joe Biden to the presidency of the United States provides an opportunity for a fundamental change of course. Do you still feel like that?
Well, it was an opportunity, but it was an opportunity that was not seized.
Indeed. So let's talk about the U.S. response immediately. I mean, that, Israel has a right to defend itself was said by the U.S. and it was echoed by everybody else. Even President Biden went on to talk about the beheading of children. There's no proof. He's talked about rape. Well, I was in Israel, as I said. We were taken. I don't know whether you've seen that 45 minutes collage of video clips from the 7th of the 10th. Right, you've seen it. Excellent. We were shown that in one of the secure IDF sort of locations, offices. And one of the things that stuck with me, and this is not to say, to make light of all the atrocities and horrid, clips that was in there. But the one thing that I did not see, and, since you've seen it, you can confirm to me, is there was no sign of sexual assault or rape, given that that's a collection of video clips that was put together, we presume the most horrid, from 7th of the 10th, that was put together by the IDF, which is not open to everybody to see. You get to watch it in a secure room. They take away your phone or the electronic gadgets. Yet, President Biden continues to repeat some of those narratives which Israel has not been able to prove. Why is President Biden echoing Netanyahu, indeed by extension, Israeli right-wing government?
Well, let me answer your question in two parts. I mean, first, let me talk about the rape and the sexual assaults.
Okay.
Because that did happen. Now,
how do we know?
Yeah, no, it did. I mean, in fact, what I would urge your listeners to do, if they can get on the web, is just to look at the New York Times had a very detailed article yesterday. So it's still easily found
yesterday.
On the web. Yes.
Okay.
And just
I haven't seen that yet. Okay.
Running through a number of the survivors, the eyewitnesses, I think at this stage, there's no question that systematic rape in several different locations took place.
If I may interrupt you on that, just quickly. Yeah. If I may interrupt you. So one of the things that became apparent to me when we were in Israel was we were taken to several places. I actually went to Far Atzra. You know it. It's nearest you get to Gaza in southern Israel. We were also presented, we also met with families of the hostages, right? In the building, the Bring Them Back Home building, etc. When one of the families of the hostages said, and I remember this sticking with me, he said, the people who came, when Hamas broke through, the kibbutz, which, as you know, are on the borders or in the backyard of Gaza. When Hamas broke through the gates, other criminal elements came with them, followed them. This is from one of the families of the hostages, not me. He said other criminal elements came with them and they raped and they pilfered, they robbed and ransacked the homes. Which is why I'm still asking, because you know very well when there is chaos, criminal elements will take advantage. And this is not making any excuse. I haven't read the Washington Post. The reason I keep asking for the proof is because when the family of the hostage, one of them said that to me, it got me thinking even deeper. Who were these people? Are we just presuming everybody is Hamas, even though Hamas broke through and by extension allowed the criminals, from Gaza to break through and follow them into these kibbutz and do all these atrocities, as well as the ones that Hamas did.
No, I think it's a fair point that, I mean, Hamas was accompanied by other armed groups, Islamic Jihad as an example. Some probably were just, criminal elements. But I do think and at this point, for example, with the rape, I don't think we know for sure who the rapists were.
Right.
We know that systematic rape took place, but I haven't seen a real analysis of, who exactly was the rapist. But I do think it's fair to say that Hamas was in charge of the operation. And that, if it had seen rape taking place, which was as the New York Times noted, was happening, I think, 7 different locations on a systematic basis, Hamas would have been aware of this. And if it cared, it would have stopped it. So I think it's fair to attribute this to Hamas, even if we don't at this moment know who the precise rapists were. Indeed. But I think, coming back to your question with respect to Biden and the U.S. movement, you're right that Biden has, initially really was harping on Israel has a right to defend itself. He would, have a token statement saying they have to do it with respect for humanitarian law, but he never would push that. Now, since then, the rhetoric has changed a little bit. I mean, the U.S. government was pushing very hard to open up the border for more humanitarian aid to come in. Biden twice used the term indiscriminate bombing, which is accurate. That's a war crime, They've been pushing for greater attention to civilian casualties. They've been pushing Israel to stop using these devastating 2,000-pound bombs. So there has been, at the rhetorical level, kind of an urging of better behavior, but no condemnation. When the UN Security Council was considering a tough resolution, at first the US vetoed it, then the second one they watered it down, so it was kind of meaningless. Biden still has not used the huge leverage he has. He could condition massive US military assistance. The US gives $3.8 billion in military aid every year. He could, enforce conditions on that. Don't use that to bomb civilians. He could impose conditions on any further weapons that the US has continued to give to Israel. So there are lots of things that Biden could be doing to make clear that he means this, broad suggestion that Israelis should take more care about Palestinian civilian casualties. He's not doing that yet. It's just rhetoric. It's not, being strong-armed. It's not really using the significant leverage that Washington has to try to stop these war crimes.
This is the thing. So Anthony Blinken made it very personal, right? Soon after October 7th, he made it very personal. None of Biden's members of Biden's cabinet have actually given Israel a red line saying, you cannot cross this. You must not cross this. I'm going to ask you a very controversial question now. Okay? In America, his nickname is Genocide Joe. Is it deserving? Does he deserve to be called that?
Well, I mean, that comes back to the question even, is this genocide, which is kind of a complicated legal question.
Okay, let's deal with that first then. Is this genocide?
Okay, well, there's a legal definition of genocide. There's a treaty that everybody, including Nigeria, has ratified. And it defines genocide as various acts, including killing. And there's no question that the level of killing is sufficient here. But it has to be killing with a certain intent. And the intent is to eradicate, in whole or in part, an ethnic, religious, national, or religious group. And the question is the killing done with this intent? And some people point to, Netanyahu's Amalek reference, killing all the men, women, children, and animals. Some people point to Galant's, these are just human animals. So those are statements that are indicative of genocidal intent. But then you have a bunch of Israeli generals who say, no, we're taking care, we're trying to spare civilians. So it's kind of a difficult legal question that at some point a court will address. I think it's a bit of a diversion because these are clearly war crimes. These are probably crimes against humanity. That's bad enough. There's a tendency to have this kind of rhetorical escalation and say, oh, if it's really bad, we have to call it genocide. No, massive war crimes are really bad. I wish, for example, that the International Criminal Court Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan would get off his behind and actually start issuing war crimes charges. He went to Rafah, the border town with Egypt, and held a kind of a half-hour soliloquy there in lieu of a press conference where he said, "This is really serious," and I'm looking at it, and nothing happened. He went to Ramallah in the West Bank, and he visited some of the kibbutzim that you may have seen, just across from Gaza. And he said, "Oh, this is all terrible, and I'm gonna, especially if they continue to stop aid, that's a war crime, and I'm gonna charge them." He went on, but nothing's happened yet. And he's been sitting on this investigation since June 2021 when he took office. So even before October 7th, there were other things he could have been charging, whether it was, Hamas's indiscriminate rocket attacks or Israel's settlements, which themselves are war crimes. So this is not a man who's been eager to take on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I hope he finally gets moving, but that will be one way to show that these are just not rhetorical war crimes, but these are legal, these are criminal, these are prosecutable war crimes. That's what we need.
Since we're in the legal space, the ICC, Israel is not part of the ICC, correct me if I'm wrong, but practically every country in Africa. In Africa, we look at the ICC as the West weaponization. They weaponize the ICC against African leaders. Yes, some of them are pretty bad. That's no excuse. But when you get bad leaders like Netanyahu, like you said, Hamas, but let's even put that aside. Leaders like Netanyahu who are favored and coddled by the United States, they can choose not to be part of the ICC. So what then is the strength of the ICC if governments can choose not to be part of it?
Yeah. Well, let me first begin with Gaza, because Netanyahu, Israel never joined the ICC, but Palestine did. And Palestine joined it because it saw that the ICC is a potential protective force. That's the same reason why many African governments joined. This is a way of trying to protect their people from some dictator who comes in and commits mass atrocities. So, when people say, "Oh, it focuses too much on Africa," my feeling is, thank God somebody's finally focusing on Africa, because these are, somebody's caring about Africans who are being slaughtered, which is good. It's the leaders, the people who are the killers, who say, "Oh, they're picking on Africa." But African people are the beneficiaries. But come to Gaza. In Gaza, Palestine has joined the court. So the court has jurisdiction for any crime by a Palestinian national, so anything Hamas does, but also any crime in Palestinian territory. So when Israel bombs in Gaza, if it's committing war crimes, the authors of those war crimes can be prosecuted, including Netanyahu. And that's, the basic rule of what's called territorial jurisdiction. That's, for example, how the ICC was able to charge Putin, because Russia has never joined the court, but Ukraine did give it jurisdiction. And so when Putin commits a war crime in Ukraine, he can be prosecuted, and indeed now has been charged. So, I wish that the ICC had jurisdiction every place in the world. That's, what Human Rights Watch pushed for 20 years ago. We didn't get that. But we did get this territorial jurisdiction, which allows governments to protect their people from, either an outside invader or, some future dictator who takes over and commits atrocities. And that's, it's not ideal. I wish it was more, but it's still very important.
Just to go back to what you said earlier with regards to countries and, when people say this is used against African leaders, somebody is focusing on Africa. Absolutely, you're right. But the US got away with Iraq. Bush and Blair got away with their lie of weapons of mass destruction. By extension, their actions led to the bringing down of Libya, which is now causing a problem in our backyard in Nigeria. Somebody's got to be held responsible for that. Blair is going around fancying all over the place, being offered all sorts of jobs. There was even some sort of rumor that he might be made some sort of peace ambassador or something in this whole war. Bush, the only time we see him is when there's a funeral. Who's going to make sure that these people who killed Iraqis, who lied to the world after 9/11, who pretty much has caused a whole lot of problem for Africa, in the Sahel region, in Nigeria, who's going to make sure that they face the crimes? Why is there no warrant against them?
Yeah, look, I'm completely with you for that. I mean, sadly, the ICC does not have jurisdiction in Iraq because Iraq never joined it. So there's a limit there. But, there's an interesting angle to what's going on in Gaza right now, which has an African precedent to it. Do you remember Charles Taylor, the former president of
Liberia?
So Charles Taylor was convicted, not by the ICC. It was before that. It was by it was called the Special Court for Sierra Leone, but an internationally backed court. He was convicted not for atrocities in Liberia, but for aiding and abetting war crimes in Sierra Leone. In particular, he was trading diamonds for arms and giving arms to what was known as the Revolutionary United Front, which is that awful rebel group in Sierra Leone that would chop off people's limbs. And Taylor was convicted and is serving a 50-year prison sentence in a British prison for aiding and abetting war crimes. Now, that is a precedent that Biden should pay attention to, because if we all accept that war crimes are being committed by Israel in Gaza, and if Biden, who knows that, he's even talked about the indiscriminate bombing, continues to send arms without conditions, he is basically opening himself up to charges of aiding and abetting war crimes. And as I mentioned, the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction. Now, is Karim Khan going to do that? I mean, this does not seem to be the most courageous guy around. So I'm not holding my breath. But, but at least, legally, we could have that. And I hope that, some of the lawyers in Washington are advising Biden that he better quickly start conditioning military assistance to Israel, or he is opening himself up to these possible war crime charges.
Indeed, one wonders whether Biden is hearing anybody at all. Let's go back to Gaza. I do actually, before I do that, because that'll take us further. You did a tweet on the killings that we had, the massacre that we had in the Northwest in Nigeria. You did a tweet, I think it's a quote, Northwest and Central Nigeria have been long terrorized by bandit militias operating from bases deep in the forest and raiding villages to loot and kidnap residents for ransom. They just killed at least 160 and wounded 300. Talk to us about that as somebody, as a former executive director of Human Rights Watch. When you look at the north of Nigeria, what are your fears that you see? A friend of mine from the north, who also is a journalist, let me put it to you what she said. She said, my fear is the north could become Congo. Do you agree? Do you have that sort of fear? Is our fear valid?
Yeah, I mean, look, the part of Nigeria that is most likely to become like Congo, I suppose, is the Northeast. And it's really the threat of Boko Haram and the fact that, significant parts of Nigerian territory are sort of no-go. They're just, they're too dangerous. This recent massacre, if I understand correctly, really happened more in the central band, which is different. And it's more reflective of, kind of long-standing ethnic religious conflict there, the fact that these bandit groups do exist. And, what for me is frustrating is watching, Nigeria has a very significant military, one that is not always lawful, but it nonetheless is a powerhouse in the region. This is not just like some modest little army. I mean, this is a serious military. And, why is it that this significant military cannot establish control over Nigerian territory? And that's the frustration. And, I don't know what's behind that, whether it's corruption, whether it's just inattention, who knows? But that, for me, is the source of enormous frustration because, I realize, Nigeria is, it's a country that should be capable of controlling its own territory. But nonetheless, there are these significant areas where large-scale slaughter takes place. And that's, of deep concern.
Yeah. The UN has demanded for a full investigation. Let me just ask you, in all your years at Human Rights Watch, and of course you work closely with the UN, have you ever known any of the bandits or terrorists in Nigeria that has ever an investigation that's happened that's led to arrest, which has led to conviction? Have you ever known of one?
Yeah, I mean, that has not happened in Nigeria. It has happened elsewhere. If you look in Eastern Congo, if you look at Central African Republic, if you look at even, Darfur and Sudan, I mean, there are places where, bandits or armed groups have been prosecuted. The same was in Sierra Leone. So it's not impossible by any means. And it takes, but I think it's worth noting that Nigeria isn't Congo. Eastern Congo is chaotic. The Congolese army barely has any control there. We shouldn't be facing that with Nigeria. Nigeria is so much stronger as a state than Democratic Republic of Congo. So we would expect more from Nigeria. And that's why it's frustrating that nonetheless these incidents take place.
Indeed. Lagos, Nigeria, I know they've got loads of questions for you. Let me just tell them, you can call. I don't know how long Professor Roth is going to spare us, but let me put out the number now. 0700 993 993 993. The female only line is 014657190. WhatsApp is 0809 597 5805. We are streaming live on YouTube and Facebook as usual. So sending your questions whilst I continue to talk to him. He's my guest, not yours, so you people cannot push through. Professor Roth, let's talk about humanitarian. So the humanitarian chief, Martin Griffiths, said on the 15th of December, Gaza is not special. No, Gaza is special, not in a good way. When you hear that, what comes to you? Because I can certainly say to you that as a civilian, as a journalist, as an ordinary person, when I hear that, not only does it rile me, it makes my spine curl. What are your thoughts?
Martin Griffith, who's been, very eloquent throughout this conflict, I think is at this stage, grasping for words that describe the horror of what he sees. Because what's happening to the people, the civilians of Gaza, is deliberate. Israel doesn't have to be blocking humanitarian aid. It's, in fact, the Geneva Conventions require access to humanitarian aid for civilians in need. And there's no question that the people of Gaza are extraordinarily needy at this stage. They're facing this massive bombardment. 85% of them have been displaced from their homes. And Martin Griffiths is looking at these people who are, living kind of in the winter, often without shelter, with minimal access to food, no clean water. And he's appalled. He doesn't even know how to describe it. So he's just grasping for words at this stage. I think he's done an excellent job of spotlighting the problem. And, as we noted, even Biden has pushed for Israel to open up the border more, but Israel just opens it up in drips and drabs. But before the conflict, 500 trucks were entering Gaza every day. During the war, a max of 100 get in, and often it's much less than that. And so it's kind of an example of the collective punishment of the Palestinian civilian population, which is a war crime. There's no reason for Israel to be fighting Hamas this way. It doesn't have to be penalizing civilians. But that's how it is fighting it. And it's doing that with U.S. military and political backing.
Indeed, Martin Griffiths wrote on Twitter, his last tweet, he said, "You think getting aid into Gaza is easy? Think again. 3 layers of inspection before trucks can even enter. Confusion and long queues. A growing list of rejected items. A crossing point meant for pedestrians, not trucks. Another crossing point where trucks have been blocked by desperate, hungry communities. A destroyed commercial sector. Constant bombardments. Poor communication. Damaged roads. Convoys shot at. Delays at checkpoints. A traumatized and exhausted population crammed into a smaller and smaller sliver of land. Shelters which have long exceeded their capacity. Aid workers themselves displaced. This is an impossible situation for the people of Gaza and for those trying to help them. This fighting must stop." Yeah, as of yesterday, reports of starvation in Gaza began to come out, and Martin did say, this is not a surprise report. We've been warning of this for a long time.
That's correct.
One has to ask, you have the likes of the EU who, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say it, actually, because we're in polite company. But you know what I mean. You have the likes of the EU who have basically been wishy-washy at best, at worst, sitting in the backyard on the side of Israel, not even demanding for a ceasefire, with the exception of Spain, who came out to say it first. Everybody else is basically, been sort of echoing what America said. And now we have hunger. Now we have people, we've seen images of Palestinians who are sort of rushing onto trucks and fighting over food. Isn't that a crime? Isn't it a crime to turn dignified human beings who are not part of Hamas into hungry people in such a way? Desperation.
You're 100% correct. And in fact, Karim Khan, the International Criminal Court prosecutor, said as much. He said, if Israel doesn't start allowing in adequate humanitarian aid, don't be surprised if my office issues war crime charges. So he said this, but what's happening? There'd be nothing like the filing of charges to force Netanyahu to pay attention. But so far, I don't know what he's doing. He gives eloquent speeches, but he's not there to be a speech giver. He's there to issue indictments when there are war crimes. And he just doesn't do that. And the situation is completely desperate, as you note. I mean, Israel, is imposing these extreme limits on aid coming in. Just yesterday, there was a case where there was a UN convoy that had gone to northern Gaza and was coming back into central Gaza with UN insignia along a prescribed route, and they were fired on by Israeli forces. It's Palestinian civilians get this all the time. Israel says, you leave your home there, head south, keep heading south. It's going to be safe over there. And then they get bombed where they end up. So no place is safe in Gaza. And
go ahead.
This kind of reflects this utter disregard for Palestinian civilian life that seems to be governing the Israeli military conduct.
69 journalists and media workers confirmed dead. 62 Palestinians, 4 Israelis, and 3 Lebanese. 15 journalists were reported injured. 3 journalists were reported missing. 20 journalists were reported arrested. Multiple assaults, threats, cyber attack, censorships, and killings of family members. Even when I was going to Israel, despite the fact that it was at the invitation of the Israeli ambassador or embassy who wanted, African reporters to come and see for themselves, I can assure you that my family were petrified. My friends were petrified. They were convinced that I wouldn't come back because Israel was killing journalists.
Yeah.
Insane.
Well, yeah. There have been cases where Israel has deliberately targeted journalists. Human Rights Watch put out a report a couple of weeks ago about an attack in southern Lebanon where there were, clearly marked car of journalists, and Israel fired on it and killed 1 and injured, I think, 4 or 5 others. So clearly some of these attacks have been deliberate. Some are just the product of the indiscriminate bombardment. If you're a journalist in Gaza, you've got as much of a chance of being killed as just an ordinary civilian. And, some number are just inevitably going to die because so many are dying. Notably, though, you were invited to Israel proper. I don't know if you wanted to go to Gaza, but they wouldn't have let you go.
I did ask to go to Gaza. They had actually said, part of the notes they sent to us was, would Ireti like to go to Israel and see things for herself, including going to Gaza, which I didn't even think twice. Immediately, I said, yes, of course. But the nearest we got to Gaza was Far Atza, which is the kibbutz. One of the kibbutz that was attacked. Some 3 kilometers from Gaza, you could see Gaza ahead. Let me just tell you, when I saw that, and I saw in my head, who builds a community, and we have such gated communities in Nigeria, as you know, and let's be frank, they're pretty affluent compared to other communities, right? Who builds such a community in the backyard of the world's largest open air prison? 1 perimeter fence, not a wall, a perimeter fence, 1 perimeter fence, with 2 perimeter fence, 1 close to the kibbutz, the other 1 or 2 meters away, and then 2 kilometers down, 3 kilometers down is Gaza. And I kept thinking to myself, I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you, the word that kept coming to me was, this is provocatively arrogant. Am I wrong?
Well, I think the fence around the kibbutz was not meant to protect people from Gaza.
There you go.
They were trusting the Israeli military to protect people from Gaza. And if you go to the Gaza border, there are multiple fences and there are all these, patrol towers and automatic weapons and the like. It just failed. I mean, Hamas quickly neutralized it using drones and the like. They bulldozed through the fences. And so the big protective barrier fell. And of course, the modest one around the kibbutz was not going to then be sufficient. One interesting thing is that the people who live in kibbutzes or kibbutzim in Israel tend to be the progressive people. The kibbutz are, there's kind of the old socialist model of everybody sharing. And so the people who live there tend to be on the political left side of the spectrum. A lot of them are pro-peace, anti-Netanyahu. That was one of the sad ironies, is that these were the people who were killed. These were, in many ways, the Palestinians' ideological friends. But Hamas didn't care. They were just Israelis, and they went after anybody they could find.
Indeed. Let me answer a call. Yeah, go on. Go on, please. No, please go ahead. Because my people are going to yap me. You know what we call yap in Nigeria? They're going to be upset with me. We didn't get to ask him any questions.
All right.
Go ahead.
I just want one thing. I mean, it's noteworthy that, you basically were given the propaganda tour within Israel.
Yeah.
But, they didn't let you go into Gaza. And the handful of journalists they've let in have been in very guided tours under military control. They're not letting people cross from Egypt into Gaza to be just journalists on their own and look around. And so as a result, we're still learning what's happening because enough Palestinians there are reporting it. But we're not benefiting from having independent journalists like you be able to just roam around within Gaza to report back to us on, what Israel is doing. And that's by design. They don't want you to do that.
Indeed. I mean, we were even in Jerusalem and I wanted to go to the West Bank. Nobody would take me. But let me give you...
That's crazy.
Totally crazy. In fact, I snuck off to walk to the UN office because, as you know, Israel is at war with the UN. Look, it's a whole conversation. Let me allow you to grab a glass of water. We've got 3 minutes news headlines and then we'll come back to you, sir.
Very good. Okay.
Thank you.
Fresh as it breaks on 99.3 Nigeria Info. The headline news on 99.3.
Welcome back to Borderlines Lagos, Nigeria, wherever you're listening to us from. You can call. Okay, I'm going to share my guest with you now because I know some of you have been calling and couldn't calm down. 0700 993 993 993. The female only line is 014657190. Zainab is going to be reading out the WhatsApp because it's full. Prof, look, thank you so much for giving us this extra time. We're monopolizing your time, but I trust you is for good reasons, I promise you. Let me go straight to the calls. Hello?
Good afternoon to you again.
Good afternoon. Who am I speaking with, please?
Good afternoon to your guest as well.
Yes.
Mrs. Oboli.
Mrs. Oboli, go ahead with your question, please.
Hearing this news of death and, war everywhere and all this, it's so disheartening and depressing. But I want to ask, please, if severe sanctions, like severe threat sanctions were issued out, like ostracization or annihilation, will it nip this in the bud? Not carrying it out, but
what do you mean sanctions? If sanctions were
issued out,
okay,
yes, to the Israelis, okay, if you continue this,
okay,
this is what we're going to do.
Okay.
By higher powers.
Okay.
Will it nip this in the bud?
Okay. Thank you.
Not carrying it out anyway, but just tell them you will annihilate them or ostracize them.
Okay.
Completely.
All right.
Nip it in the bud.
Oh, okay. The lines are going. Thank you very much. I'll ask him that. I don't know if he can hear you, but I've made a note of it. Hello?
Good evening, Sisoge.
Good afternoon. Good evening, rather. What's your name and where you calling from, please?
Hello, is my name. I'm calling from Lekki.
Okay, go ahead.
I just want to thank your,
my guest,
your guest.
Professor Kenneth Roth.
Yes, he's so sincere and straight to the point.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing I want to ask, do we really blame Israel for bombing the, that is where people are, the populace are, or the Hamas? Because we know they use their people to shield, as a human shield. There was a time they showed us a hospital. Under the hospital, there was a hole that was dig, these tunnels, loaded with weapons.
Okay.
So Hamas knew that Israel could come to them through that, and they still use their people as a human shield.
Okay.
It's not fair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello?
Good afternoon, Sisoge.
Good afternoon. What's your name and where you calling from, please?
Yeah, you have Emmanuel on the line.
Go ahead, Emmanuel.
Yeah, first question. There are these anti-Palestine policies, imposed by Israel. For instance, of which, if a Palestine prisoner dies in Israeli prison, the body won't be released, until the service year of the prison term. Does your guest think that perhaps this war is over? Will they water down some of this policy? Another question is that it is one of the things I'm hearing is that Israel is trying to fund building of another location, for the displaced Palestine people. What does your guess take from this?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that is my question.
Thank you very much. Right, so I have 3 questions for you, Prof. The first one is sanctions from one of our regular listeners. She said, do you think sanctions against Israel will work? Of course, we've had Omar Bugatti here, one of the co-founders of BDS. But Mrs. Oboli wants to know, do you think sanctions will work to stop Israel? That's number 1. Number 2, another one of our listeners said, can you blame Israel for bombing Gaza, given that, and this is her words, given that Hamas is known to be hiding behind civilians, and of course also Hamas, she saw a video where an Hamas tunnel was shown under her hospital with ammunition. That's number 2. Number 3 is, and I was going to come to this later, but I'll ask you now, anti-Palestine policies in Israel. Of course, he's talking about the apartheid, the fact that Palestinians are under one jurisdiction, Israelis are under a different jurisdiction, the fact that Palestinian dead bodies are not released, etc., the administrative detention, etc. Over to you.
Okay. Those are good questions. Let me begin with the sanctions point. I mean, the simplest sanction, if you want to call it that, would be to start conditioning or ending the military aid, start conditioning or ending the arms sales. I mean, that would have an immediate effect. That would be the most targeted sanction possible because it's only, targeting the entity that's doing the killing, the Israeli army. And so I think we should really begin there. There's no need to talk about, kind of broader sanctions when we should be depriving the Israeli military of the tools to commit war crimes until it stops. Simple as that. Now, the question about Hamas using human shields, that's a good question because that's what the Israeli government says all the time. And when you say, why are so many Palestinian civilians dying? Oh, Hamas is using human shields. I think we should, on the one hand, recognize that Hamas does sometimes use human shields, other times it does fire from populated areas, but that's not the end of the story. And Israel doesn't want you to continue the story. It doesn't want you to ask the next question because international humanitarian law says that even if the other side is using human shields, the attacker still has to ensure that the anticipated harm to civilians is not disproportionate. And what we're seeing over and over again is that, yes, Hamas may have, a bunker underneath a refugee camp, but that doesn't mean you can use a 2,000-pound bomb, or actually two 2,000-pound bombs and three other bombs to decimate the refugee camp, to kill hundreds of civilians. That's not a proportionate attack. And the reference to the hospital was a perfect example. Israel was telling us over and over, there's a major Hamas command center under Al-Shifa Hospital, Al-Shifa being the major hospital in Gaza. What did they find in the end? A handful of rifles and one tunnel. Nothing, just nothing to justify shutting down.
And a calendar.
Yeah, exactly, right, which it was very suspicious, So, but the point being that by the time Israel took over the hospital, there was no Hamas in sight. So there's no immediate need to take over the hospital. The military advantage was modest at best, whereas the civilian cost was enormous, shutting down and incapacitating this huge hospital. So that is a clearly disproportionate attack. Saying Hamas was using human shields just doesn't begin to answer the question. And Israel doesn't want you to move on to this other essential part of the analysis.
The third question is apartheid. He wanted to know the anti-Palestinian policies by Israel.
Yeah, well, I think, Human Rights Watch issued a major report finding...
Sorry, may I just interrupt you? Can you define apartheid for us? Because a lot of people get it mixed up. They don't know the difference. Please define apartheid for us, sir.
Okay, well, in the report that we did, we very deliberately said that the aim was not to just make an historical analogy to South Africa, but rather we were applying international law. And the crime of apartheid is actually defined in two different treaties in international law. One is the UN Convention Against Apartheid. The other is part of the International Criminal Court's Rome Statute, the founding document of the ICC. And the definitions are slightly different, but they're similar enough. And what they in essence come down to is you have to have an intent by one racial or ethnic group to dominate another. And that we found clearly existed throughout Israel and the Palestinian territory. Second, you have to have systematic oppression. And then third is what are called inhumane acts, but examples of that oppression. And we found that those last two elements existed in the occupied territory. So these three elements came together in occupied territory. Now, when we would point out this systematic oppression traditionally, people would say, don't worry, there's the peace process, that'll take care of it all. But, you could live with that maybe for a year or two, but, 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, that was not an answer anymore. This was becoming permanent reality. And we just said, we've got to face what's there, not what might be after some mythical peace process. And what's there today is complete apartheid. You've got, the Israeli settlements where they live under Israeli civil law, they're flourishing. And right next door, you've got these Palestinian villages living under military law where they can't even add a bedroom onto their house without it getting demolished. Their resources are being taken away. They have to travel on separate roads. They have all these limitations on where they can travel. It's a complete two-tiered apartheid system. And the answer to that is either, give everybody equal rights within one state, or start removing the settlements and move back to the possibility of a two-state solution, which currently the government has no intention of doing.
Indeed. Let's take some questions from WhatsApp.
Right. Good evening, Sosioge, and greetings to your wonderful guest. I like a sincerity in this discourse. I want to ask, do we blame Israel for bombing some of the public places, or Hamas that uses citizens for human shield? For example, Hamas used the biggest hospitals to hide weapons and dug tunnels under them.
I think we've already answered that. It's the next question.
All right. So this one is coming from Abi Ambo from Badagry. He says the recent discovery of massive tunnel in Gaza running northward of the Strip is quite a discovery. What does your guest think of this recent discovery by IDF?
Okay, they remember the big tunnel that they say. In fact, I think it was discovered whilst I was in Israel, and I don't know whether you know Elion,
where they drive trucks through.
Elion, the Israeli government spokesperson said, "Oh, Ireti, you're from London. It goes as wide as the Northern Line. You understand what that means, don't you?" Yeah, that one.
Look, I mean, everybody knew that Hamas has this massive tunnel network in Gaza. I mean, that certainly is true. And targeting those tunnels is a legitimate military action on the part of the Israelis. But that's only the beginning of the story. You still have to ask, are they attacking the tunnels in a way that is not indiscriminate, that is not imposing disproportionate harm on Palestinian civilians? And they're just failing to live up to that responsibility. So it's not enough to say, look at this big tunnel. The question is, okay, well, are you attacking it in a way that avoids civilian harms? Or are you indifferent to civilian harm and just using these massive bombs and devastating whole neighborhoods? Sadly, Israel is doing the latter.
Indeed. Do we have any more?
Yes.
Very quickly?
Yes. Mr. Marcos is asking, who controls Gaza, Israel or Hamas? Can Israel build wall like that of Trump and Mexico?
Well, we've answered this question many times, but since you are the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, perhaps they will believe you. Who controls Gaza? Can Israel build a wall? Is that what it is?
Yes.
Can Israel build a wall around Gaza? I know it's a question. I've got to put it to you. I can see the look on your face.
I mean, in terms of, just day-to-day life in Gaza before the war, Hamas was in control, but Israel continued to occupy Gaza. And it's worth, explaining what that means, because Israel didn't have troops on the ground. So it wasn't the kind of occupation you see in the West Bank where Israeli troops are running every place. It was different. Basically, it was creating, a large open-air prison, and Israel was the prison guard. And so, there was very little commerce allowed. For example, why does Gaza not have an airport? Why does Gaza not have a seaport? Why does Gaza have to basically, put everything through these checkpoints? It's why are so few Gazans able to travel? People who cannot visit their relatives in the West Bank, people who cannot go abroad for university. These are the ways in which Israel maintained control over Gaza, even without having troops on the ground. And that's why, in our view, it did continue to be occupied. And in fact, most everybody feels that way.
Indeed. Actually, you mentioned the word occupied, and most people, they hear occupied territories. People are not quite sure what you mean by occupied. So if you could just kind of define it for us. Sure. When we say, occupied West Bank, occupied Gaza, etc.
Okay. If you look at in June 1967, just before the major war that broke out, then the Six-Day War, Israel existed within what people call the Green Line. And those are the internationally recognized borders at this stage. Israel as a state is recognized within those borders. But with that 67 war, Israel took control of Palestinian territory as well. And there are three key elements of Palestinian territory that Israel has occupied since then: the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And so when people say the Palestinian occupied territory, that's what they're referring to, those three areas that Israel controls, but that is not recognized as belonging to Israel. Israel's an occupying power.
Okay. Have we got any more questions?
Yes.
I'm going to come to your calls. You can call. I will come to your calls.
Momo from Ikorodu is asking, is today's Israel the same as the biblical Israel?
Oh, okay. Is today's Israel the same as the biblical Israel? We get this question every week, by the way.
Yeah.
I even get it on my DM.
I'm not sure people know, what the exact geographical contours of biblical Israel were. I think it's safe to say that, Jews can trace their history to that area, going back to biblical times. Palestinians can trace their history going back, centuries and centuries too. So you have, two people with claims to this land. And the international community has said the fair allocation of that land is that Israel gets the 67 boundaries and Palestine gets the rest. Now, that's a bit unfair to Palestine because it's only 22% of the land that goes to Palestine. But they're not even being given that 22% because Israel has been occupying it.
I have a question here. So just to let you know, some of my friends are also tuned in. I have a question here sent to me directly on my WhatsApp. It says, it seems that Netanyahu may have had his own program in ensuring that the two-state solution never worked. What do the people of Israel want? Is there a survey to show? Does your guest think if Hamas was outlawed, a two-state solution can be embarked upon, especially after Netanyahu leaves, assuming a probe will force him out?
Yeah, it's very hard to say what the people of Israel want. The public has moved significantly to the right in recent years. That's partly demographic, and it's partly the growth of the ultra-Orthodox movement. It's partly the reaction to violence from Palestinians. But I do think, in an odd way, the disaster of October 7th also presents an opportunity to reassess, because there, I think, is a growing willingness that the Netanyahu strategy of just perpetually kicking the can down the road, pretending that the occupation could be forever, that there'd be no consequences, that they could just bludgeon the Palestinians into acquiescence, that failed. Now, the other issue, though, is who's going to negotiate for the Palestinians. Hamas is, in a sense, a de facto authority, but it doesn't recognize Israel. It's committed to violence. It's going to be a difficult negotiating partner. The Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, an 86-year-old man who has not had an election in 16 years and is corrupt and is, completely discredited, he doesn't have the capacity to really lead Palestinians either. Many people talk about a guy, Barghouti, who's in prison by the Israelis, who is seen as having a lot of credibility. It's unclear, but what's needed is some new group of Palestinians who are respected, who are not, tainted by violence, who could engage in negotiations with Israel from the Palestinian side. None of this is easy, but it's absolutely essential, because the status quo of just perpetual repression, perpetual apartheid, is not a solution.
Given what we've been saying now, like I said, with 21,000 dead and rising, is it possible to find these young new leaders who have not been tainted by violence? Is it really?
I think it is. In other words, Palestine is a sophisticated society. There are many educated people. There are many people who can have a range of political views. We shouldn't equate Hamas with the Palestinian people. I think that the war in some ways has bolstered Hamas because they're seen as resisting Israel. In other ways, it's discredited Hamas because Hamas is utterly indifferent to Palestinian civilian lives itself. It knew that its actions on October 7th would lead to large-scale loss of civilian life, and it did it anyway. So I think we just don't know at this stage. We should not assume, in fact, I think it's wrong to assume that Hamas in some way is the same as the Palestinian people. There are many people.
But Israel is treating the Palestinian people as Hamas. Otherwise, so many civilians wouldn't be dying.
That's how, they try to justify ignoring Palestinian civilian lives by almost, effectively pretending there are no Palestinian civilians. Even the president of Israel sort of said, well, why didn't the people of Gaza rise up against Hamas? That would be suicidal. Hamas was a military dictatorship. You rise up against Hamas, you get shot. But it's sort of, he was basically blaming Palestinian civilians for Hamas's existence, which is just not fair. But it does show, I think, this desire to pretend that, all Palestinians are guilty, so let's not worry so much about their deaths. And that's just completely wrong.
Some have banded the name of Hanan Ashrawi as
Yes.
a possible
She's a former negotiator.
Yes. What do you think? Because here's the thing, right? I've got to be frank with you. On one side, we have right-wing extremists, mostly men. On the other side, we have a resistance stroke terrorist group, mostly men, right? In the middle, we have the PLO, who are pretty much impotent, mostly men, right? One can't, I mean, I'm a big fan of Angela Merkel, okay? Can Hanan Ashrawi be the Angela Merkel that we need in this conversation, in this room, who is not being invited to this conversation?
I mean, I think your point that it would help to have Palestinian women represented in any negotiating team, even leading the team, it's an excellent point. Hanan Ashrawi, I'm afraid, is sort of the last generation's leader.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not sure that she's able to do that now. But we do need to find, who is today's Hanan Ashrawi, who could help to create a kind of, a moderate, respected Palestinian leadership, where then the Israeli government couldn't say, oh, we don't have anybody to negotiate with, which is a great excuse for Israel, but is not the truth.
Well, do we have any more questions?
Yes, one
more.
more.
We have a question.
This is from OA. He's saying, how is the two-state option meant to work? Gaza Strip is one side of Israel, while the West Bank is on the opposite side.
Excellent point. It's a very good question. And it's funny, after I got back from Israel, when I describe it, I say to people, hold your hand up, hold your right hand up. The part near your thumb is Gaza. The part near your little finger is West Bank. And in the middle of that is Israel. How is the two-state solution going to work? Number one. Number two is, who is going to tell the settlers to get out, to actually abandon, given that they've expanded by some 700, settlements?
Okay, I mean, these are good questions. In terms of just, the disjointed nature of Palestinian territory, I mean, it's a problem, but it's not an insurmountable problem. I mean, at the time of the Oslo Accords, there was talk about, building, a kind of a bordered highway between the two. And just having free access on this highway. You could have it be, guarded highway if there was a security issue. But, these are solutions where solutions can be found. I mean, even if there was not a direct path between Israel, you could have Gazans travel via, Egypt and Jordan between the two places. I mean, it's not insurmountable. You could have an airport and fly between the two. So this is, there are worse problems than that. Now, in terms of the settlements, I mean, Israel did have a precedent of actually withdrawing a handful of settlements from Gaza when they left the land forces there, even though they continued to occupy the exterior. The West Bank is a much bigger problem. There are many, many more settlements there. And the settlers have become a powerful constituency. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to leave their homes. I mean, one option on the table would be to let them continue to live in their homes, but their homes revert to Palestine. So they would have to accept themselves as citizens of Palestine, or they could be dual citizens or whatever. It's, if we look around, I mean, if you look at sort of what happened with South Africa, I mean, white South Africans, when they ended apartheid, accepted that they were going to live as equal citizens of a broader, multiracial South Africa, and this has worked out reasonably well. So I think it's important to recognize that there are lots of options out there. But Netanyahu didn't want to discuss any of them. He just wanted to keep the occupation permanent. And that we've now seen is just not the solution.
My gosh, you've been so generous. But last question before we let you go. Last question. What would a one-state solution look like?
Well, I mean, a one-state de facto is what we have today. And, I mean, one key element, if you really are going to have one state that's not apartheid, is you have to have equal rights for everybody. That's a basic requirement.
Would Israel do that?
They really don't want to. But what we have to make clear is that the alternative for them, which is just perpetual apartheid, also is not a solution. And so that may push them. I mean, if they don't want equal rights within one state, And if apartheid is intolerable, that may push them back to reopening negotiations for a two-state solution, what Netanyahu has been trying to avoid forever.
Thank you so much. But you know what I said to everybody when I got back from Israel? It was such a... It opened up my eyes even more. What I say to everybody, and tell me if I'm wrong or if you agree, is the only way Israel will get back to the table to talk solution is if America says so. Would you agree?
You're completely right.
Thank you so much.
Right. And that's why, we got to keep pressuring Biden.
Thank you so much, Prof. An hour and a half. I know.
My pleasure.
Thank
our
you.
Conversation.
You've been most generous. Really enjoyed having you with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Take care and have a good new year.
To you as well and to your listeners.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The number one talk station of Lagos is closer to you than ever.
Join the conversation online or on the go.
Be part of the Info family on our user-friendly mobile app and website for a better and improved listening experience.
Download the app from Google Play Store and App Store.
With super efficient and clean audio quality.
Log on to nigeriainfo.fm.
Watch us live on YouTube and Facebook.
Follow us on Twitter at NigeriaInfoFM.
And Instagram at NigeriaInfoFM Lagos.
99.3 Nigeria Info.
Let's talk.
Welcome back, Lagos, Nigeria, wherever you are listening to us from. What an interview. What an amazing, educating, sort of charging interview. What do you have to say? What are your questions? Now we've got 30 minutes left to the end of the show. You can ask me, because I understand some of you had been wanting to ask me questions about my trip to Israel. You can ask me, you can call in to ask me whatever you want to ask me, and I'll do my best to answer. I've kind of written the first draft of my article, not the second draft, because it fell into the holidays, right? 0700 993 993 993 01465 7190. Oops, the lines are going. I'm coming to you now. Hello?
Cecile,
yes.
Good evening once again.
Good evening.
Yeah, you have Emmanuel. I actually asked.
Oh, your line just cut off, Emmanuel. I don't know what happened there. Literally just cut off. Oops. I don't know. The lines have gone funny. Okay. Try again. 0700. Literally, the lights are off. 0700 993 993 993. The female only line is 01465 7190. WhatsApp is 0809 597 5805. You've just listened to an hour and a half of my conversation with Professor Kenneth Roth. Do you have anything to add to that? Any comments to make? Or do you have any questions for me regarding my trip to Israel? Okay? You can call now. Something's happened with our lines. I don't know what it is. But yeah, have we got any questions on WhatsApp? Please read out.
Not
Yeah?
right now.
Not right now. Okay.
I saw a comment applauding you.
Oh.
And I'm trying to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think there's... Okay, the lines are back. Yeah, it's working again. Hello? Turn off your radio, please.
Hello.
Yes.
Good afternoon, Cecile.
Yes, good afternoon. How are you? What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Yeah, this is the merchant man.
Okay, merchantman, go ahead.
Cecile, if not be said the place you go was a one-ton region, I would have asked you for a cake or chocolate.
Well, yeah, it was a war zone. No cakes or chocolate.
So, my question is, on your own personal assessment of what has been on ground, because all this while we've been trying to build hypotheses and all that, trying to create theories of what happens, what we see in all these compromised media outlets. You came back with first-hand information. So my question to you is, based on your assessment of what has happened, what would you give as an account based on what you saw. Is it that the genocide, the way it has been reported by the compromised media outlets, is it the way it is? Or do you see something that people are trying to make sure they move out terrorists who are really wreaking havoc around the region? So that is my question.
So what's your question again? What's the exact question itself? Is it what?
My exact question is, based on your personal assessment of what is happening, can you say it is genocide on the side of Israel, or can you say that they are fighting a war of trying to make sure they exterminate terrorists on the ground?
Okay, I understand. Stay
that
listening.
Is my question.
Okay, stay listening, merchant man. Do we have any questions?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Well done, Madam Ireti. I really respect your investigative journalism.
Well, I'm not an investigative journalist. I'm just a broadcast journalist
with advocacy for humanity in Gaza. Thanks for your voice for the voiceless. May God bless you. Borderline hashtag.
Okay. Thank you so much
From
for that.
Afiz Olodia Papa.
Okay. Thanks, Afiz, for your lovely compliments, but too big. I'm not an investigative journalist. I'm a broadcast journalist. And that's I write articles sometimes, But anyway.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Momo from Adamo is asking, what's the relationship between Israel and the U.S. in the relation with this war?
What do you mean? That's such a... Have you been...
In relation...
Okay, we don't have a guest now, so this is in the family. Have you been following this news? Oh, boy, what's the name? What's the name of the person that's in the...
That's Momo.
Momo. What do you mean what? I don't understand that question.
What's the relationship between Israel and the U.S. in the relation with this war?
What's the relationship? Well, Israel has been giving... U.S. has been giving Israel support, more than support. They've sat on the back of Israel. They've pushed Israel ahead. They've said Israel has a right to defend itself. They've given Israel ammunition. Some of the ammunition that is being used to kill civilians has come from Israel, and they continue. And this is not the first time Israel has been a big financial U.S. has been a big financial supporter of Israel, right? I will invite you to go and Google AIPAC, AIPAC. Then you will have a better understanding of what we're talking about. Okay, let me answer your question, Merchant Man. You ask, so because I've got to be, we're not having this conversation over dinner or over drinks, right? I have a sense of responsibility to my job and to my skill, and because mine is a voice that has a lot of followership. So I am not a lawyer. Please note that. I am not an expert on genocide. Please note that. But me, Ireti Bakare-Yusuf, aka Sisioge, as an ordinary person, yes, I do believe we are watching genocide. In fact, every time I hear a quote from one of Netanyahu's people, when I say his people, his cabinet members, we say Tinubu's people, his cabinet members and his coalition, because remember, he's got a coalition, it's a coalition party that made him prime minister. You have the extreme right wing and then you have the Netanyahu right wing, if you like. Every time I hear a quote from them, the word that comes to my head is genocide. Okay, so whilst I was there, did I see? No, of course I didn't. But that wasn't the intention of what they were going to be showing us. That they were never going to be showing us anything like that. So what did I see? Okay, I've got a bit of time. If you like, you can call in 0700 993 993 993. But I think there's something wrong with our line, to be honest with you. 014657190. What did I see out there? Let me tell you. I came back. So the intention was for us to sort of see Israel's side of the story. Indeed, we saw Israel's side of the story. That's all that was shown to us, right? Israel's side of the story. But of course, I had to do my job. My job is to question and probe and challenge, not just to accept anything that's put in front of me. I'll be back. Let me just answer that call. Hello?
Hello, good morning. Good afternoon.
Good morning, long. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. This is your radio song, Not.
Okay,
so
go ahead.
Let me help you answer Igwe Victor's question. When an opposing force starts a war that by taking out two media towers, I think that's very suspicious. Then, unfortunately, I would have liked to ask the guest about his opinion. You know, during the Russia-Ukraine war, America gave cluster bombs to Ukraine, although they said it was a deterrent and it was banned. I would have wondered if that was like a breach of human rights. Then even Ukraine itself had questions on the side of supplying weapons to Myanmar military.
Why didn't you send in a WhatsApp? Because that cluster bomb part is a very good question. So, in fact, to the point where the UK had to hands off and say, we're signed up against that, so we cannot support that. You make a very good point. I wish you had sent in a WhatsApp.
Before this war started, there was this, let me not make any advertisement, this program on Al Jazeera. It starts with an L and ends with a T. They did like a 2-hour special. So like one thing I saw before then, I think what people need to really understand, which I think you got since you were on ground, is the conditions these people are living in. They were like, if you're in the Palestine part of Israel and you're in the Israel control part, it's night and day. As in the Palestine part, it's just like roadblocks, watchtowers. In fact, that's not living. So for me, after this thing, I think they will even have to review as in UN policy this thing that just one person can truncate the whole process. Doesn't make sense.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I do wish you had. Now I'm going to tell you, I've gone face the wall. You should have sent in a WhatsApp. You see, you had all those important questions. Thank you. Thank you so much. You make excellent points. Thank you. Hello.
Hello.
Good evening.
Good afternoon. This is Tunde calling from Michigan.
Go ahead, Tunde. What's your question or comment, please?
My question is that when you visited Israel, I want to know the exact, because I used to hear from majority people, although maybe it's a propaganda, but I want to know who is exactly the owner of the West Bank and Gaza. I want to know. You know, if you need to go ask this question because you visited Israel. You know, there are sometimes there will be propaganda over news, over broadcasting. I want to really, really know.
Right.
So that is why I'm asking this question.
Okay.
And number two is that, please, this your alternative ladder I used to call. Nobody picking it. The old one and the last 993. The former ladder you
0700 993 993 993. Maybe there's something wrong with it.
The old one.
01465 7190.
That's the female line. I'm not supposed to call that line.
Okay. Right. So, I think it's all sort of joined together. So when I'm not going to answer questions, I'm not going to answer calls anymore because we don't have much time. So I can try and answer your questions. So what did they show us? So what we were shown was just Israel's side of the story. Are you with me? Now, we were taken to the kibbutz that I mentioned, which is Kfar Aza, which is Kfaraza. Aza is actually Gaza. And from that kibbutz, you literally can see Gaza ahead of you. I think I've described it before, being that, you know, when you're on a Zumba and you see Queen's Drive, double that, because 3 kilometers, that water is not 3 kilometers, but if you kind of double it, that's kind of the distance, right? Okay. So we saw that. They showed us the video. We met with family members of the hostages, of a couple of the hostages. What was the other thing? They showed us the video. Then they took us to Jerusalem. Okay. And throughout that, both in Tel Aviv, we landed in Tel Aviv, both in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem throughout. I think we had about, say, 3, 4, or 5 speakers come to address us. And each one came to present Israel's side of the story, right, from their angle. So, for instance, there was a lady who was, who she said she teaches international law. And so she was presenting Israel's side of the story. She basically said, look, I'm thinking of giving up law. I don't think I can teach law next year because, nobody seems to be on our side. Nobody, there's been so much international law that's broken. And she also mentioned about this rape part. She said, UN women, it took them so long to speak out on the rape. And she kept going on about international law. And I said to her, at some point, I said, like I said to our guest, Israel isn't signed up to international law. So if you're concerned about the ICC, Israel isn't. Oh no, that's the other thing. She said, thank God the ICJ, the guy from the ICC, the head of the ICC, that he came to Israel, etc., etc. And that's when I said to her, but if Israel isn't signed up to the ICC, who then are you expecting to be prosecuted? You're just talking about Palestinians. And I explained to her the way I explained to my guest. I said, look, the ICC is pretty much weaponized, as far as we're concerned in Africa, against Africa. And now the Palestinians. Israel, who you're representing, isn't a part of the ICC, right? Anyway, that was that conversation. There was another guy. So we had different, I don't want to go into it because interestingly, I'm planning to have them all as a guest at some point or the other. This is all the holidays and everybody's got to get a rest. Yeah, so we had, there was another guy that came to address us, who was the government spokesperson. You may have seen him on Al Jazeera. His name is Elion. Incidentally, one of the things that became apparent to me was how so many Israelis were from Europe. So Elion is from London, right? Incidentally, he's from Finchley. We connected on the Finchley level. Huh? He went to school there. He was born in London. He sounds just like me, only he's got a white man's voice, literally, right? So you get, the other guy that addressed us, Mikhail, who is Michael, he's from Russia. So you get to understand how so many Israelis are actually, if you like, returnees, as we call them in Nigeria. Either they're first generation or second generation returnees. That's literally what it's made up of. So the hotels that we stayed at, the two hotels that we stayed at, the first one in Tel Aviv, the second one in Jerusalem, I discovered very quickly that, because I couldn't watch any English speaking channels, and I kept wondering, where is Al Jazeera, where is CNN, where is this, where is that? And then when I went to ask downstairs, I was informed that this hotel, which is the one we're staying at in Tel Aviv, was had become home to, this is the word, refugees of October 7th. Well, I would call them victims of October 7th, but that's the word that was used, that it become home to refugees of October 7th. And and then they had decided to change the sort of bouquet that they get in the hotel. Oh, I thought, okay, interesting. So, of course, I go outside, as I do, to chill, to have a cigarette. And there's somebody sitting out there. So I go to talk to him. And I said, hello, my name is Ireti. I'm from Nigeria. I'm a journalist, yada, yada, yada. And I asked him if his home was affected. He said, yes, his home was affected somewhere. I can't remember where it was now. I interviewed him. His English wasn't very good. It was really difficult. But I'll tell you what was very clear when I was talking to him. And I did ask him if I could record him, and he said yes. What was very clear, what he was able to get clear was, I hate Arabs. So I said, do you have any Arab friends? And he said, yes, but their heart is not good. I'm not there to change his mind, remember? I'm there to hear him. I went to him after all to ask for his opinion, to hear what he's got to say. That was one. When we got to Jerusalem, I spoke to a couple of moderates. Let me go back a bit. After we arrived in Israel, one of the things that I kept asking was, I would like to speak to Palestinian. Are there Palestinian Israelis? If you notice, there are, even my guest mentioned Palestinian Israelis Palestinians who live in Israel, right? But the response I kept getting back was there are Palestinian Arabs. And I'll be like, but Arabs from where? What does that mean, Palestinian Arabs? They've got to come from this, like saying there are Palestinian blacks. Well, or there are, she said Israeli Arabs, I beg your pardon. I kept saying Israeli. What do you mean by Israeli? They said, well, they're just Israeli Arabs. Well, what does that mean? Israeli blacks are 99.9% from Ethiopia. So you can't just call them Israeli blacks or Israeli Africans or whatever. You have to know where people are from. Context matters. Anyway, I said, are they Palestinians? And I was told, well, they don't like to be called Palestinians. Okay, I don't argue. I have no evidence to the contrary, irrespective of what I may think. I just kept it, as we say in Nigeria, on my left hand, and I thought, I'm going to find out a little bit more about that before I leave. Anyway, so we get to this hotel in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, and I speak to a couple of moderates, and there are moderates. There are moderates who were pretty much liberals, who were opposing what Israel's policies and actions towards the Palestinians. Well, these moderates that I spoke to had moved towards what the government was doing. And then I'll give you this other example before I tell you what my final analysis is. Then I noticed something. All the waiters looked Arab. Now, often you can't tell the difference, okay, between an Israeli and Arab unless they're in their religious garb. You honestly can't tell the difference. But I noticed in the hotel that they were all Arabs. They all looked Arabs, all these waiters. So, of course, you trust me. I'm having breakfast, and I say I always look for Zainab just burst out laughing. I always look for the young people because, as far as I'm concerned, they're the ones that will tell you the truth. So I'm talking to this young waiter, and I said to him, are you Israeli Arab? He said, yes, I'm Arab. But I said, where are you from? He said, I'm from Jordan. And then he tells me about his education. He asked me where I'm from. I say Nigeria. And he's like, I had a lot of Nigerians in my course, yada, yada, yada. He's an engineer. He's unemployed since he graduated, which is some years back. He couldn't find a job. Hence, he's doing what he's doing. Okay. So I said to him, do you mind, what do you feel about Palestinians? Do you hate, do Jordanians or the Arabs in Israel hate Palestinians? And he said, no, of course not. Like as if to say, whatever gave you that idea. I'm like, really? He said, no, not at all. Not at all. Okay. Remember, he's talking to me. And then I said to him, what are your thoughts on October 7th? And then he said, nope, I can't talk about it. We've been told we can't talk about it. Otherwise, we'll lose our job. Boom. Like a plume of smoke, he's gone. And then I faced what was I even eating, Seth? I can't remember. But they had some lovely croissants, I tell you. Yeah. And then I felt that's why I put on weight. Blessing downstairs saying to me that I look lovely. Lovely is putting on weight because I was eating too much bread. Anyway, yeah. And he went. He said they've been warned that they can't talk about it. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So that's what I found. But in total, overall, what I came back with was, here's a nation of people who are, I'm going to use the word, indoctrinated, really. They believe what they've been told, number one. Number two, they are paralyzed by fear. And it's two types of fear. There's the fear of trauma, okay, corporeal memory. Think about it. What happened in World War II? Okay, the never again. So there's a fear that we don't want to lose our land. We don't want to be extradited again. We must hold on to this. There's also this idea, they believe that the world is against them. Right? And so many other things that I can't even remember now, but there are words that I wrote down that kept coming, that were coming to me as I spoke to people, and I'll jot them down. But yeah, that's what I left with. And so you've got to ask yourself the question. Here's the thing about fear. Fear makes you irrational, totally irrational. Fear makes your actions illogical. Fear can lead you to do so many things that is senseless. Yeah, you lose all reason. Because for as long as 21,000, think about it, 21,000 Palestinians have been killed. They're not Hamas. Only, I can't remember how many Hamas operatives Israel said they've killed. 21,000 innocent Palestinians, babies, women, men, children. I'm the mother of a son. If we lived in Palestine, he literally would either be killed or would have been arrested by now. I just want you to kind of put that in your pipe and see how it tastes. Yeah?
Sissy, what you just said about fear, it makes me want to read this message.
Okay, please do.
The person did not add his name or her name. He's saying, when you were in Israel, were you scared of any missile landing?
Oh, good question. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left. So when you go to Far Atza, like I said, is literally Gaza with the fence, right? The bombs are... Some of you may have seen me wearing a bulletproof vest. Yeah. I posted it on my Instagram, wearing a bulletproof vest and a helmet, to which my friends have had great jokes. They've made stickers out of it, and I call myself Ajoke Bond 00234. NG kind of thing. But yeah, there were bombs going off. Literally, boom, boom. Some of them sounded so close. I was like, oh dear, this is what they told me. But no, we were fine. We were safe. That's the honest truth. But yeah, there's a lot. And I do hope I finish writing my piece and hopefully it will be published. And I'll share the link on our website and everything. But there's a lot. The question nobody has asked me is, did it change my perception? Because that's what we were taken there for. I'm not going to answer that. You're going to have to read my article and then you'll find out. So, we're almost done. Zainab, what do you want to say? What's the news of the year? We have 3 minutes. I've been talking for an hour. Almost 2 hours.
International news,
whatever. Let's do it.
Well, the economy is tight. Mm-hmm. It's quite tight. So I'm just looking forward to a more relaxed economy,
a more robust economy,
in 2024 because we cannot continue in this trajectory. Sincerely.
Yes, I hear you. Definitely. Oh, by the way, are you people supporting Arsenal? Didn't West Ham beat you people yesterday? Arsenal having a rubbish New Year's Eve. I know. But yeah, I do hear you. Look, Monday is a new year. I have so many wishes, so many clocks, but I will say to you, this year, I don't even know how this year started off for me, but I can assure you it's ended in a most unexpected manner, incredibly well. So I pray to God next year starts off really well for you, but ends even better. Here's a massive... I know some of you want to call. If you want to call, I have 2 minutes because I'm not going to tell you anymore about my trip to Israel. If you want to call quickly, you can make use of it and stuff like that. If we want to send a message, you can send a message on 0809 597 5805. 2 minutes before I sign off. Do you have anything?
You can as well try any of those numbers: 012770993, 012771993, 012779993, or 012773993. Just in case you are.
In case you're having problems. Okay, there you go. Now, here's the thing. There's a show that comes on after me. It's called Music and Memories.
Music and Moment.
Oh, my word. I love it. I absolutely love it. And I don't know whose idea it was, but I've got to give them a shout out. And it's the perfect show for this evening because, party starts. I'm starting my party tonight. I promise you, I'm only going to party tonight so I can be calm. Because these days, after too much dancing, I have to rest the knees. Yeah, so I have to rest the knees for a long time. That was the other thing. Gosh, we walked in Israel. I even fell over. Yeah, I fell on my knee. Yeah. I'm going to call them out. I don't care. Ethiopian Airlines, you messed up big time. I fell flat on my knees because every one of our flights was delayed and I had to run to come back to Nigeria because I didn't want to miss the flight. And as I was walking, I haven't fallen over in years, especially since I had my knee operation. I fell flat on my left knee. Yeah, they had to lift me up. Imagine the embarrassment. A OCC will get calling. But I still styled it gingerly. A girl's got to look fine.
And your look. Today's look is gorgeous, Sissy.
Yvonne is here. Yvonne is here. She's going to be reading the news. I'm signing off now. Okay. Have a wonderful new year. I'll be back next week. Speak to you in 2024.
Happy New Year's in advance.
Happy New Year, everybody. Ciao, ciao.
.3 Nigeria Info. We are more than just radio. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Nigeria Info FM. Check us out on Facebook at Nigeria Info 99.3. Follow us on Twitter at Nigeria Info FM and on Instagram at Nigeria Info FM Lagos for live updates as it happens. 99.3 Nigeria Info. Let's talk.